If Jesus lived today, what would he stand against the most? Hello, everyone. Today we're going to explore a profound and thought-provoking question that has resonated throughout history and remains incredibly relevant in our modern world. If Jesus Christ were physically present in today's society, what would he stand against most strongly? This question may seem simple at first glance, but when we truly dig deep, it opens up an incredibly important discussion that touches on both spiritual and social dimensions of our contemporary life. When we examine Jesus' life in the Gospels, we see that he wasn't just a spiritual leader confined to temples and synagogues. He was a revolutionary figure who actively opposed social injustices, stood firmly with the marginalized and oppressed, and fearlessly confronted hypocrisy wherever he encountered it. His ministry was marked by radical love, but also by radical truth-telling that often made the powerful uncomfortable. So, in today's world, in an age dominated by technology, capitalism, consumerism, social media, political polarization, and unprecedented global challenges, what would Jesus stand against? What would move him to righteous anger? What injustices would he call out? What false teachings would he correct? In preparing this content, our primary source will be Jesus' own teachings, actions, and values as recorded in the Gospels. We'll examine our contemporary world through this lens, comparing the issues Jesus confronted 2,000 years ago with the parallel challenges we face today. Let's begin this important exploration. 1. Religious hypocrisy and performance faith. One of the most consistent targets of Jesus' criticism during his earthly ministry was religious hypocrisy, particularly among the religious elite of his day. The Pharisees and Sadducees, who were supposed to be spiritual leaders and examples for the people, became the subjects of some of Jesus' harshest rebukes. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus delivers what scholars often call the 7 woes, a devastating critique of religious performance. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to." What made Jesus so angry? It wasn't that these religious leaders were following the law. It was that they had turned religion into a performance, a show, a means of gaining social status and power, while their hearts remained far from God. They had created elaborate systems of rules and traditions that burdened people rather than bringing them closer to the heart of God. Now, if we're honest, we have to ask ourselves, how is today any different? In our modern world, particularly with the rise of social media and celebrity culture, religious performance has reached unprecedented levels. We live in an age where faith has become, for many, a brand to be marketed rather than a life to be lived. Think about it. People post pictures of themselves praying, not necessarily because they want to inspire others, but because it gets likes and follows. Megachurch pastors live in mansions and fly private jets while preaching about the humble carpenter from Nazareth. Christian influencers curate perfect images of their blessed life, while struggling believers feel inadequate because their faith doesn't look as Instagram-worthy. Jesus explicitly warned against this in Matthew 6, verse 5. "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." In today's context, Jesus would likely stand firmly against the commercialization and performance of faith. He would oppose the celebrity pastor culture where spiritual leaders become untouchable figures surrounded by wealth and power, disconnected from the poor and suffering they're called to serve.
He would challenge the prosperity gospel that turns faith into a transaction, promising material blessings in exchange for donations, completely inverting his actual message about storing up treasures in heaven rather than on earth. The religious industrial complex, where faith becomes a product to be sold, conferences to be monetized, and followers to be counted as metrics of success, would likely receive the same treatment the money changers received in the temple. Jesus physically overturned their tables because they had turned his Father's house into a marketplace. How much more would he oppose the turning of his entire message into a brand? But here's the challenging part. This isn't just about famous preachers and influencers. It's about all of us. Every time we post about our faith to appear spiritual rather than to genuinely encourage others, every time we perform religiosity in public while harboring hatred, judgment, or indifference in private, every time we use religious language to justify our prejudices or our comfortable lives while ignoring the suffering around us, we participate in the very hypocrisy Jesus condemned. The Pharisees weren't evil people. They were religious people who had lost sight of what mattered most. They had become so focused on the external markers of faith, the visible acts of piety, the public recognition, that they had forgotten the heart of God's law, to love God and love others. 2. Wealth inequality and economic injustice. If there's one thing abundantly clear from Jesus' teachings, it's his concern for economic justice and his warnings about wealth. This is perhaps one of the most
uncomfortable aspects of Jesus' message for many modern Christians, particularly in wealthy nations, but it's impossible to ignore. Jesus talked about money and wealth more than he talked about heaven and hell combined. Let that sink in. The Bible contains about 500 verses on prayer, fewer than 500 verses on faith, but more than 2,000 verses on money and possessions. This wasn't a minor concern for Jesus, it was central to his teaching. In Luke 16:13, Jesus says clearly, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." This isn't a suggestion or a recommendation, it's a statement of incompatible allegiances. The famous story of the rich young ruler in Mark 10 is particularly revealing. A wealthy man comes to Jesus asking what he must do to inherit eternal life. Jesus tells him to sell everything he has, give it to the poor, and follow him. The man walks away sad because he had great wealth. Jesus then says something shocking. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Now imagine Jesus walking through our world today. He would see a level of wealth inequality that would have been unimaginable in the first century. He would see a world where the richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 50% of humanity combined. He would see economic systems designed to keep the poor trapped in poverty, while the wealthy accumulate more and more. He would see predatory lending, exploitive labor practices, tax systems that benefit the rich while burdening the poor, and corporations that value profit over human dignity. Jesus would stand in the halls of power, in the boardrooms of mega corporations, in the chambers of governments that serve the wealthy elite, and he would speak the same truth he spoke 2,000 years ago. Woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. But here's what's crucial to understand. Jesus wasn't against wealth because money is inherently evil. He was against the hoarding of wealth while others suffer, the pursuit of wealth as life's primary goal, and the false security that wealth promises. He was against economic systems that create and perpetuate inequality.
In our modern context, Jesus would likely oppose the extreme capitalism that treats humans as mere economic units, the consumerism that tells us our worth is in what we own, the system that allows someone to have billions while others have nothing. He would challenge the narrative that success equals wealth and that poverty is a moral failing.
Think about modern prosperity gospel preachers who tell people that God wants them to be rich, that poverty is a sign of weak faith. This is the exact opposite of what Jesus taught. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, and sell your possessions and give to the poor." He didn't say, "Name it and claim it," or "sow a seed of $1,000 and reap a harvest of prosperity." Jesus would stand with the minimum wage worker who can't afford rent despite working 2 jobs. He would stand with the medical debt-burdened family, the homeless veteran, the single mother choosing between groceries and medicine. He would challenge those of us who have more than enough to open our eyes to those who have far too little. And here's the uncomfortable truth for many of us. By global standards, most people watching this video are wealthy. If you have a roof over your head, food in your refrigerator, and can afford internet access, you're richer than a significant portion of the world's population. Jesus' words about wealth apply to us, too. The question isn't whether you have money, it's what you do with it. Are you hoarding it for security and comfort, or are you using it to bless others? Are you spending it on luxuries while ignoring the needy, or are you generous and compassionate? Do you trust in your bank account or in God? Number 3, the marginalization and mistreatment of the vulnerable. Throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus consistently gravitating toward those who were marginalized, rejected, and oppressed by society. This wasn't incidental to his ministry, it was central to it. His first recorded sermon in Luke 4 quotes Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free." Jesus spent time with tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, the sick, the poor, foreigners, women in a patriarchal society, and children when they were considered unimportant. Every group that society pushed to the margins, Jesus pulled to the center. In Matthew 25, Jesus identifies himself directly with the vulnerable. He says that when we care for the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned, we care for him. And when we ignore them, we ignore him. This is one of the most radical statements in Scripture. The Son of God identifies himself not with the powerful and prestigious, but with the powerless and forgotten. So, what would Jesus stand against in our modern world? He would stand firmly against every system, attitude, and policy that dehumanizes and marginalizes the vulnerable. He would oppose the refugee crisis, where millions of displaced people are turned away, treated as threats rather than as human beings made in God's image. He himself was a refugee. His family fled to Egypt to escape Herod's violence. When nations close their borders to desperate families seeking safety, when we criminalize asylum seekers, when we separate children from their parents at borders, Jesus would undoubtedly speak out. He would stand against systemic racism that continues to oppress and marginalize people based on the color of their skin. Jesus crossed cultural and ethnic boundaries constantly, shocking his disciples by talking to a Samaritan woman, healing a Roman centurion's servant, and praising the faith of foreigners. He broke down walls of division and would oppose every ideology and system that builds them up. He would oppose the neglect and abuse of the elderly, the warehousing of our senior citizens in facilities where they're forgotten by society and sometimes even by their own families. He would challenge cultures that value people only for their productivity and discard them when they can no longer contribute economically. Jesus would stand with the disabled, challenging the ableism that treats them as less than fully human, that questions their quality of life, that excludes them from full participation in society.
He spent his ministry healing and restoring dignity to those with disabilities, always treating them as whole persons worthy of love and respect. He would oppose the mass incarceration systems that warehouse human beings, often for nonviolent offenses, in conditions that degrade rather than rehabilitate. Jesus said he came to proclaim freedom for the prisoners. He would challenge us to see those behind bars as people capable of redemption, not as irredeemable criminals. He would stand with the homeless, those experiencing mental health crises, addiction struggles, and poverty. Instead of criminalizing homelessness or looking away uncomfortably, Jesus would sit with them, eat with them, and challenge us to do the same. And here's something that might make some uncomfortable. Jesus would stand with those marginalized by religious communities themselves. He would oppose churches that turn away LGBTQ+ individuals, divorced people, those struggling with addiction, or anyone deemed too sinful to be welcomed. Jesus was called a friend of sinners as an insult by the religious elite, and he wore that title proudly. The Pharisees criticized Jesus for eating with sinners and tax collectors. His response? "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Jesus' whole mission was to reach the marginalized, the outcasts, the people that society and religion had written off. Today, Jesus would ask the church a hard question. Who are you marginalizing? Who feels unwelcome in your spaces? Who are you treating as second-class citizens in the kingdom of God? Who are you judging rather than loving? Jesus had a particular disdain for those who abused positions of power and authority. While he taught respect for legitimate authority, he also modeled how to speak truth to power and challenge unjust systems. When the religious and political leaders of his day used their positions to oppress rather than serve, Jesus didn't stay silent. He called King Herod a fox, a term of contempt. He stood before Pilate, the representative of Roman imperial power, with remarkable dignity and challenged the very basis of his authority. He confronted the chief priests who had turned the temple into a profit-making enterprise. In Mark 10, verses 42 to 45, Jesus explicitly redefines what leadership should look like. "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is a revolutionary concept. Power as service, leadership as sacrifice, greatness measured by humility. In our modern world, Jesus would stand against the abuse of power in all its forms. He would oppose political leaders who use their positions for personal enrichment rather than public service, who lie to their constituents, who accept bribes and serve special interests over the common good, who fan the flames of division to maintain power. He would stand against corporate leaders who exploit workers, prioritize shareholder value over human dignity, engage in wage theft, union busting, and unsafe working conditions, all while compensating themselves lavishly. The CEO-to-worker pay ratio in many countries has reached obscene levels, with executives making hundreds of times what their average employee earns. Jesus would oppose the abuse of power in religious institutions. The Catholic clergy's sexual abuse scandal, the cover-ups by leadership, the protection of predators over the protection of children, this would receive Jesus' strongest condemnation. Any religious leader who uses their spiritual authority to abuse, manipulate, or exploit others betrays everything Jesus stood for. He would challenge the cult of personality that develops around some religious leaders, where they become untouchable, unaccountable, surrounded by yes-men who never question their decisions. Jesus modeled servant leadership. He washed his disciples' feet. He would oppose any leader who demands to be served rather than serving others. In the realm of police and criminal justice, Jesus would oppose the abuse of power that leads to brutality, racial profiling, and the violation of human rights. He would challenge
the militarization of police forces and the use of excessive force against peaceful protesters and vulnerable populations. Jesus would stand against domestic abuse and violence, the abuse of power within families where the strong terrorize the weak. He would protect children from abusive parents, women from abusive partners, and the elderly from abusive caregivers. He would oppose the exploitation inherent in human trafficking, modern slavery, and forced labor. There are more enslaved people in the world today than at any point in human history. This would break Jesus' heart and provoke his righteous anger. In educational institutions, Jesus would challenge professors and administrators who exploit students, who create toxic environments, who abuse their positions of authority over vulnerable young people. Essentially, wherever power is used to oppress, exploit, or abuse, rather than to serve, protect, and uplift, Jesus would stand in opposition. He would remind those in positions of authority that they will be held accountable for how they used their power. 5. Judgment, condemnation, and lack of mercy. One of the most beautiful aspects of Jesus' character was his incredible compassion and mercy, particularly toward those caught in sin and failure. While he never condoned sin, he always offered grace and a path to transformation. Think of the woman caught in adultery in John 8. The religious leaders bring her to Jesus, ready to stone her according to the law. They're using her as a test case, trying to trap Jesus. But Jesus turns it around. He says, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." One by one, they drop their stones and walk away. Then Jesus does something remarkable. He doesn't condemn her. He doesn't lecture her. He simply says, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." He offers both grace and a call to change, mercy and truth together. This is Jesus' pattern throughout the Gospels. He shows mercy to the tax collector, the prostitute, the thief on the cross, the disciple who denied him. But his harshest words are reserved for those who lack mercy, who are quick to judge and slow to forgive. In Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" Jesus would stand firmly against the judgmental, condemning spirit that characterizes so much of modern Christianity. He would oppose Christians who are more known for what they're against than what they're for, who major in judgment and minor in love.
He would challenge the culture of cancel culture, both within and outside the church, where one mistake can define a person forever, where there's no room for growth, redemption, or second chances. While accountability is important, the rush to condemn, to destroy someone's reputation and livelihood over a past mistake or poor judgment, lacks the mercy Jesus modeled. Jesus would oppose the harsh, condemning approach many Christians take toward those struggling with addiction, mental health issues, or sexual sin. Instead of offering compassion, support, and a path to healing, we often offer judgment, shame, and exclusion. He would challenge the legalism that creates endless rules about what it means to be a good Christian, rules about music, clothing, drinking, dancing, movies that completely miss the heart of the gospel. The Pharisees did the same thing, creating elaborate systems of do's and don'ts, and Jesus consistently challenged their rigidity. Jesus would stand against the weaponization of Bible verses to condemn others, while ignoring the verses that challenge our own behavior. It's easy to quote verses about sexual sin, but ignore verses about greed, gossip, pride, and lack of compassion for the poor.
He would oppose the social media culture of outrage, where we rush to condemn others, to point out their failures, to engage in public shaming. Christians participate in this just as much as anyone else, maybe even more, because we can cloak our judgment in religious language. Jesus would challenge churches that make people jump through hoops to belong, that create insider and outsider groups, that treat some sins as worse than others, that offer quick condemnation but slow restoration. At the same time, and this is crucial, Jesus would not oppose righteous anger at injustice or the need for accountability. There's a difference between being judgmental and standing against injustice. Jesus showed righteous anger at the money changers in the temple, at religious leaders who burdened people, at those who harmed children. The key is the spirit and the motive. Are we condemning others to feel superior, to maintain our own sense of righteousness? Or are we speaking truth because we genuinely care about justice and the well-being of others? Are we offering condemnation, or are we offering truth wrapped in love? Jesus managed to be full of both grace and truth. He never minimized sin, but he always offered mercy to the repentant. He called people to higher standards while acknowledging their struggles. He was tough on the self-righteous and tender with the broken.
We've touched on wealth inequality, but this deserves its own section because it was so central to Jesus' ministry and teaching. Jesus' concern for the poor wasn't peripheral, it was absolutely core to his message. In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, Jesus tells a story about a rich man who lived in luxury while a poor man named Lazarus lay at his gate, covered in sores, longing to eat scraps from the rich man's table. When they both die, Lazarus goes to Abraham's side while the rich man goes to Hades. The rich man's sin wasn't active cruelty, it was passive neglect. He simply stepped over Lazarus every day and did nothing. This is a terrifying warning for us. Jesus is saying that indifference to suffering is itself a damnable offense. Not feeding the hungry when you have the means, not clothing the naked when you have extra clothes, not caring for the sick when you could help. This is serious sin in Jesus' eyes. In Matthew 25, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus says the nations will be judged based on how they treated the least of these. Did they feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, care for the sick, visit the imprisoned? This isn't a minor theme in Jesus' teaching. It's how he says we will ultimately be evaluated. James, Jesus' brother, writes in his epistle, "Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it?" In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Now think about our world today. We live in an age of unprecedented wealth and unprecedented poverty existing side by side. We have the resources to end extreme poverty, to ensure everyone has clean water, basic health care, and adequate nutrition. We have the technology and the wealth. What we lack is the will and the compassion. Jesus would stand against our collective apathy toward global poverty. He would challenge wealthy nations that spend trillions on military budgets while cutting foreign aid. He would oppose economic policies that prioritize corporate profits over human welfare. He would stand against the individualistic mindset that says, "I earned my money, I don't owe anyone anything." This is fundamentally opposed to Jesus' teaching. In Luke 12, Jesus tells a parable about a rich man who builds bigger barns to store his abundant harvest, planning to relax and enjoy life. God calls him a fool and says, "This very night your life will be demanded from you." Then Jesus adds, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God."
Jesus would oppose Christians who live in comfort while ignoring the suffering of others, who justify their wealth and privilege while turning a blind eye to poverty and need. He would challenge the theology that suggests God rewards the faithful with material blessings, implying that the poor must lack faith. He would stand against governments that cut social safety nets, that make it harder for the poor to access health care, education, and basic necessities,
all while protecting the interests of the wealthy and powerful. Jesus would oppose the criminalization of poverty, where being poor is treated as a moral failing, where the homeless are arrested for sleeping in public, where the hungry are prosecuted for stealing food. He would challenge the narrative that poverty is always the result of laziness or poor choices. While personal responsibility matters, Jesus recognized that systems and circumstances often trap people in poverty. He didn't blame the poor for their poverty, he commanded the rich to share their wealth. And here's what might be most convicting. Jesus would challenge those of us who claim to follow him but rarely think about the poor, who never sacrifice our comfort to help others, who live for ourselves while others suffer. He would ask us the question he asked in the parable. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me something to drink? When I was a stranger, did you invite me in? Jesus' prayer in John 17 reveals one of his deepest desires, unity among his followers. He prays, I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Unity wasn't just a nice idea for Jesus, it was essential to the credibility of the gospel message. He knew that a divided church would undermine its own witness to the world. Throughout his ministry, Jesus consistently broke down barriers that divided people. He crossed ethnic boundaries, speaking to Samaritans when Jews avoided them. He crossed gender barriers, treating women as equals in a patriarchal society. He crossed social boundaries, dining with outcasts and sinners. He crossed religious boundaries, praising the faith of Gentiles while challenging the unbelief of religious insiders. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus makes the hero of the story a member of a hated ethnic and religious group. The religious leaders pass by the wounded man, but the Samaritan stops to help. Jesus was deliberately challenging his audience's prejudices and tribal loyalties.
So what would Jesus stand against today? He would oppose the intense polarization and tribalism that characterizes our modern world, particularly within Christianity. He would stand against Christian nationalism that confuses allegiance to a nation with allegiance to God, that wraps the cross in a national flag, that treats political ideology as if it were divine revelation. Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. He would oppose any attempt to claim God for one political party or nation. Jesus would challenge the us versus them mentality that pervades so much of modern Christianity, the conservative Christians versus progressive Christians, the traditional versus the contemporary, each side convinced they have the monopoly on truth and viewing the other with suspicion and contempt. He would oppose the echo chambers we create, where we only listen to voices that confirm what we already believe, where we demonize those who disagree with us, where we retreat into tribes that reinforce our biases. Jesus would stand against racism in all its forms, the belief that some ethnicities are superior to others, the systems that perpetuate racial inequality, the attitudes that dehumanize people based on skin color. He would challenge white supremacy and any ideology that creates hierarchies of human value based on race. He would oppose the xenophobia and nationalism that treats foreigners as threats rather than as neighbors. Remember, Jesus commanded us to love our neighbors, and when asked, "Who is my neighbor?" he told the story of the Good Samaritan, making it clear that our neighbor is anyone in need, regardless of their ethnic, religious, or national identity. Jesus would challenge the partisan hatred that has infected the church, where Christians on different sides of the political spectrum view each other as enemies rather than brothers and sisters. He would oppose the tendency to make political positions into tests of orthodoxy, to question someone's faith because they vote differently. He would stand against the sectarianism within Christianity itself, the denominational pride that suggests only our group has it right, that looks down on other Christian traditions, that creates unnecessary divisions over secondary issues.
Jesus would oppose the culture wars that pit Christians against the broader culture in ways that communicate hatred rather than love. Yes, Christians should stand for truth, but Jesus said people would know we are his disciples by our love, not by our political positions or cultural battles. He would challenge the tendency to reduce complex human beings to labels and categories, liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, immigrant or citizen, us or them. Jesus saw people as individuals made in God's image, worthy of dignity and respect regardless of their beliefs or background.
Jesus would oppose the hate speech, the slurs, the dehumanizing language we use toward those we disagree with or fear. He would challenge Christians who mock, ridicule, or demean others, especially in the public arena of social media. At the same time, Jesus would oppose the false unity that compromises truth. He wasn't afraid to speak hard truths or to call out error, but he did so with a heart of love, always seeking redemption rather than destruction. The unity Jesus prayed for isn't uniformity. It's not everyone thinking exactly alike. It's a unity rooted in love, in shared commitment to Him, in humility that recognizes we all see through a glass darkly, in grace that allows for differences while maintaining essential truth. 8. Environmental destruction and greed. While environmental issues aren't explicitly addressed in the Gospels because they weren't issues in the first century as they are now, we can extrapolate from Jesus' teachings about stewardship, greed, and care for future generations. In the creation account, God gives humanity dominion over creation, but dominion doesn't mean domination or exploitation. It means stewardship, responsibility, caretaking. We're called to be good stewards of what God has entrusted to us. Jesus taught extensively about stewardship through parables: the parable of the talents, the parable of the shrewd manager, the parable of the rich fool. All address how we handle what has been entrusted to us and the accountability we'll face for our stewardship. Given this emphasis on stewardship and Jesus' concern for future generations, he loved children and said the kingdom belongs to such as these. It's not difficult to imagine that he would stand firmly against the environmental destruction we're witnessing today. Jesus would oppose the corporate greed that prioritizes short-term profits over the long-term health of the planet. He would challenge the extraction and exploitation of natural resources without regard for the consequences, the pollution of air and water that disproportionately affects the poor, the destruction of ecosystems for financial gain. Climate change, driven largely by human activity and our consumption patterns, threatens the most vulnerable populations on Earth. Island nations face rising seas. Drought threatens food security in already struggling regions. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and severe. The poor, who have contributed least to the problem, suffer most from its effects. This injustice would not escape Jesus' notice. Jesus would stand with indigenous communities whose lands are being destroyed, whose water sources are being polluted, who are being displaced by resource extraction
and environmental degradation. He would oppose the attitude that treats the earth as merely a resource to be exploited, rather than a gift to be treasured and protected. He would challenge the consumerism and materialism that drives overconsumption, the endless pursuit of more stuff that requires more resources, creates more waste, and never satisfies. Remember, Jesus said, life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. He warned about the deceitfulness of wealth and the danger of pursuing material things. Jesus would oppose the sacrifice of future generations' well-being for our present comfort and convenience. The intergenerational injustice of leaving our children and grandchildren a degraded, polluted, less livable planet would grieve him deeply. He would challenge the denial and minimization of environmental crises, the willful ignorance that allows us to continue harmful practices without examining their consequences. Jesus valued truth and confronted those who distorted reality to serve their interests. At the same time, Jesus would oppose the environmental movement when it becomes a form of idolatry, when creation is elevated above the Creator, when concern for animals supersedes concern for human dignity and welfare. The balance Jesus would strike is seeing environmental stewardship as a moral and spiritual issue, not just a political one. It's about loving our neighbors, including our global neighbors and future generations. It's about stewarding God's creation responsibly. It's about rejecting the greed and short-term thinking that destroys the planet for profit.
To exploit our psychological vulnerabilities, to keep us engaged regardless of the cost to our mental health, relationships, and spiritual lives. He would oppose the comparison culture that social media fosters, where we constantly measure ourselves against carefully curated versions of others' lives. This breeds envy, discontentment, anxiety, and depression. Jesus taught contentment and warned against comparison and envy. Jesus would stand against the cyberbullying, the online cruelty, the mob mentality that social media enables. Behind the anonymity of screens, people say things they would never say face-to-face. Christians participate in this too, engaging in online arguments, posting cruel comments, sharing harsh judgments, all while claiming to follow the one who said to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. He would challenge the way social media amplifies division, spreads misinformation, and creates echo chambers where we're only exposed to views that confirm our existing beliefs. The algorithms that control what we see are designed to engage us, often by showing us content that makes us angry or afraid, not content that makes us wise or compassionate. Jesus would oppose the way technology allows us to be present physically but absent mentally and emotionally. Parents scrolling through phones while their children seek their attention. Couples sitting together but absorbed in separate digital worlds. Friends gathered but all on their devices. Jesus valued presence, attention, genuine connection. He would challenge the illusion of connection that social media provides while we experience record levels of loneliness. We have thousands of online friends, but few people who truly know us. We broadcast our lives, but hide our struggles. We present perfect images while battling private pain. Jesus would stand against the pornography epidemic enabled by internet technology, the objectification and exploitation of human sexuality, the industry that profits from degradation and addiction while destroying marriages, warping perceptions of sexuality, and enslaving millions in compulsive behavior. He would oppose the way technology enables constant distraction from silence, reflection, and prayer. We fill every quiet moment with content consumption. We're terrified of boredom, of being alone with our thoughts, of silence. But it's in silence and solitude that we often hear God most clearly. Jesus regularly withdrew to quiet places to pray. He would challenge the surveillance capitalism that treats us as products, that harvests our data, manipulates our behavior, and profits from our attention while giving little thought to the psychological and social consequences.
At the same time, Jesus wouldn't oppose technology itself. Technology is neutral. It's how we use it that matters. He would affirm the good that technology enables, connecting with distant loved ones, accessing information and education, spreading the gospel, organizing for justice, creating beauty and art. The question Jesus would ask us is, does technology serve you, or do you serve it? Is it a tool you use for good, or has it become a master that controls you? Does it enhance your relationships and spiritual life, or does it distract from what matters most? 10. Neglect of mental and emotional health. Throughout his ministry, Jesus showed profound compassion for those suffering emotionally and mentally. He comforted the grieving, spoke peace to the anxious, offered hope to the despairing, and brought healing to those tormented by what the gospel writers often described as demons, but might today be understood as mental illness. Jesus never dismissed emotional suffering or told people to just have more faith and get over it. He wept with those who wept. He had compassion on the crowds because they were harassed and helpless. He offered rest to the weary and burdened. In our modern world, despite all our medical advances, mental health remains stigmatized, particularly in religious communities. Jesus would stand firmly against this stigmatization and the harmful attitudes that often accompany it. He would oppose the teaching that mental illness is simply a result of sin or lack of faith. While sin and spiritual health are related to overall well-being, reducing complex mental health conditions to spiritual failures is both theologically wrong and deeply harmful. Jesus never treated physical illness as a moral failure. He wouldn't treat mental illness that way either. Jesus would challenge churches that tell depressed people to just pray more, just have more faith, just trust God more, as if depression were simply a choice or a spiritual deficiency. This adds guilt and shame to already overwhelming suffering. He would stand against the lack of mental health resources in many communities, particularly for the poor, who often cannot access quality care. He would challenge the healthcare systems that treat mental health as less important than physical health, providing inadequate coverage and support. Jesus would oppose the culture of toxic positivity that denies the reality of suffering, that pressures people to always appear happy and blessed, that treats grief, sadness, or struggle as signs of weakness or faithlessness. The Psalms are filled with lament, with honest expressions of pain and struggle. Jesus himself experienced deep anguish in Gethsemane.
He would challenge the stigma that prevents people from seeking help, that makes mental illness something to hide rather than address. He would oppose the judgment and fear that often greets those who are open about their mental health struggles. Jesus would stand with those suffering from anxiety, depression, PTSD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and countless other conditions. He would validate their suffering, affirm their worth, and advocate for their access to good care. He would oppose the pharmaceutical companies that price mental health medications beyond the reach of many who need them, that prioritize profits over patient welfare, that market medications irresponsibly. Jesus would challenge the societal pressures that contribute to mental health crises, the relentless pace of modern life, the constant connectivity that prevents rest, the achievement culture that measures worth by productivity, the comparison culture that breeds inadequacy, the isolation of modern living that leaves people lonely and disconnected. He would stand against the abuse and trauma that often underlies mental health struggles. He would oppose domestic violence, childhood abuse, sexual assault, and all forms of trauma that wound people psychologically and emotionally. He would challenge the inadequate support for those in crisis, the lack of suicide prevention resources, the mental health system that often fails those most in need. Jesus came to give life abundantly. He would grieve the loss of life to suicide and work to prevent such tragedies. At the same time, Jesus would affirm the spiritual dimension of emotional health. While not all mental illness has spiritual roots, spiritual practices like prayer, community, worship, and scripture can be important parts of holistic healing. Jesus would advocate for integrated care that addresses the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Conclusion. As we've explored what Jesus might stand against in today's world, some themes have emerged consistently. Jesus opposed hypocrisy, greed, the abuse of power, the marginalization of the vulnerable, lack of mercy, tribalism and division, and the neglect of both physical and mental suffering. But here's what's crucial to understand. Jesus didn't just oppose things, he offered an alternative. He didn't just criticize, he demonstrated a better way. His opposition to injustice was rooted in his profound love for humanity and his vision for how life could be lived in the kingdom of God. Jesus opposed religious hypocrisy,
but he offered authentic relationship with God. He opposed wealth inequality, but he modeled generosity and taught contentment. He opposed the marginalization of the vulnerable, but he welcomed and dignified everyone. He opposed the abuse of power, but he modeled servant leadership. He opposed judgment, but he offered mercy. He opposed division, but he built community. He opposed greed and idolatry, but he pointed to true treasure in heaven. The question we must ask ourselves isn't just what would Jesus oppose, but what would Jesus have us do? It's not enough to identify what's wrong with the world. We must be part of making it right. If Jesus would oppose religious hypocrisy, then we must pursue authentic faith. If he would oppose wealth inequality, then we must be generous. If he would oppose the marginalization of the vulnerable, then we must welcome and advocate for them. If he would oppose abuse of power, then we must use whatever influence we have to serve others. If he would oppose judgment, then we must extend mercy. If he would oppose division, then we must build bridges. If he would oppose greed and idolatry, then we must examine our own hearts and priorities. Jesus' harshest criticisms were reserved for religious people who should have known better. That's a sobering reality for those of us who claim to follow him. We can't point fingers at the world's problems while ignoring our own complicity. We can't criticize others for their failures while excusing our own. But here's the good news. Jesus didn't come to condemn the world, but to save it. His opposition to evil was always motivated by love and aimed at redemption. When he confronted sin, it was to free people from it, not to shame them into submission. When he challenged systems of injustice, it was to liberate both the oppressed and the oppressors. The same Jesus who stood against all these things also died for the people perpetuating them. He died for the hypocrites, the greedy, the abusers of power, the judgmental, the divisive. He died for all of us because we've all participated in systems and attitudes he opposes. That's the scandal and beauty of the gospel. Jesus extends grace to those who deserve judgment, including us. But grace isn't cheap. It cost Jesus everything, and it calls us to transformation, to actually becoming the people he calls us to be. So as we think about what Jesus would stand against, let's also think about what he stands for. Love, justice, mercy, humility, generosity, unity, truth, compassion, and abundant life for all people. Let's ask ourselves if our lives reflect these values. Let's examine whether we're part of the problem Jesus would oppose or part of the solution he offers. The world is broken. It was broken in Jesus' day, and it's broken in ours. But Jesus didn't come to merely critique the brokenness. He came to heal it. And he invites us to join him in that healing work, to be agents of his kingdom, to be salt and light, to be peacemakers and justice seekers, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. What would Jesus stand against? Much of what we see around us, and if we're honest, much of what we see within us. But the more important question is, will we stand with him? Will we align our lives with his values? Will we follow him not just in belief, but in practice? That's the challenge before us.